A Critique of Steven Universe. Or, Why Steven Universe Doesn't Work. By Ahmed Alomit. Edited by Captain Failmary. Forward. This is something that I've been meaning to write for about a month or so. I began to have problems with Steven Universe a few months back or thereabouts, but it was only during April of this year that I began to consider typing this essay. My friends and I have been discussing this back and forth for about as long, trying to find the best way to explain our thoughts about the show in a concise manner, and finally I decided to just bite the bullet and get everything out there. Now, before I get into the meat of this essay, I'd like to preface the rest of this writing with an important statement, because I don't want my opinions to be misconstrued accidentally or otherwise. I do not hate Steven Universe, anyone involved in the production of the show, or the fans. The folks behind Steven Universe are all fine people creating, I'm assuming, what they believe is a fun show, and I have nothing but respect for them doing so. I also don't expect anyone reading this to feel bad for liking Steven Universe, and I honestly don't care if you do because it's none of my business in the first place. You go right ahead and like whatever it is you like. Nothing I'm about to say in this essay should be taken as gospel. This is first and foremost an opinion piece and not intended as an authoritative statement about the quality of the show. As an aside, it's kind of shocking that I even need to say that, but given the climate on the web these days it pays to cover your ass. I'd also like to apologize right off the bat for any spelling errors, poorly constructed sentences, or anything else that sucks about this essay. I don't write stuff like this very often. One more important thing I'd like to point out is that this essay contains massive spoilers for Steven Universe and a few other shows, so continue reading at your own risk. If you haven't watched the entirety of the show and you still want to be surprised, stop reading now. Anyway, in order to properly examine this show I decided to break this analysis down into segments for the sake of clarity. Originally this was going to be a shorter piece, but you know how that goes. So, without further ado, let's get started. About the show. Steven Universe is a program that currently airs on Cartoon Network. It's a show about a magical boy who looks kind of like a Danny DeVito wishing troll, who lives with a trio of humanoid space aliens, also magical, who have sworn to protect the Earth. The premise and certain aspects of the show's presentation give it the feel of an older anime production without totally aping the style, and it's staffed by a number of veteran storyboarders from other Cartoon Network shows like Adventure Time. One of my favorite storyboarders, Ian Jones Quarterly, works on this show. I had a lot of excitement for Steven Universe going in. The pilot was great, it set up a lot of interesting ideas and I liked the characters. Steven, the main character, seemed like a neat protagonist at a time when Finn from Adventure Time, back when I still watched that show, was starting to get stale. The moody atmosphere of the pilot was what interested me the most. Cartoons made for television have done dark atmosphere before, but at the time that the Steven Universe pilot came out there weren't very many shows like that on the air. I was excited to see how the show would handle something like this. When the show finally premiered on Cartoon Network for real, there were some changes. New designs for everyone. Now, what I'm about to write here might shock you, I actually didn't hate the new designs. Sure, I preferred some things the way they were in the pilot, like Garnet's hair, but what we got in the redesign wasn't bad. Amethyst and Steven weren't much different at all, and I actually considered, and still do consider, Pearl's new design to be an improvement. I missed the darker and more realistic designs from the pilot, but I could appreciate the softer, cutesier style, and the gorgeous backgrounds by Kevin Dart really helped ease the transition. The show comes out and it becomes an instant hit. I enjoyed the first few episodes. Steven was a likable protagonist, I appreciated the chemistry he had with the Crystal Gems, and I also liked that they weren't afraid to pull any punches when it came to the more dramatic or scary episodes, like Fribo or So Many Birthdays. The tension in those episodes felt right, and it was something televised cartoons, at least here in the US, haven't had much of for a very long time. Of course, this is where the big but comes in. You can't miss it, it's right around the corner. The biggest fault of Steven Universe is probably how it handles drama. Now, I feel I should clarify right away that I love the idea of a kid's cartoon trying to tackle what Steven Universe attempts to handle. There's some heavy plot here. Most cartoons nowadays, and from really any era in general, are either episodic, which isn't bad at all in itself. Some of my favorite shows are of an episodic nature, which usually prevents any kind of drama from unfolding, or they have continuity but handle the drama poorly. Adventure Time, I'm looking at you. It's admirable for the staff to say, let's try something different, and actually go with it. For the first few episodes they actually handled this aspect of the show pretty well. They had it down pat in Fribo and So Many Birthdays, along with Cat Fingers, which is a personal favorite of mine. These episodes all worked, and are examples of Steven Universe at its best. The problem is that the staff apparently didn't learn to evolve the writing beyond the formula of those episodes, leading to repetitious, predictable setups. It's usually like this. Something innocent or cute is happening, then suddenly, something bad happens. Cue drama. Let's take a look at So Many Birthdays. In this episode, Steven discovers that the crystal gems have never celebrated their own birthdays during the centuries that they've been alive, so he decides to host several birthday parties for all three of them in order to make up for it. The gems don't really like, or seem to even understand, parties, which causes Steven to become upset. This, combined with Steven's self-reflection, activates the power of the magical crystal on his stomach, which reacts to his emotional state, but disaster strikes when the reaction begins aging him rapidly throughout the course of the episode. The gems find him as he morphs into an old man, a process which is slowly killing him. Now of course, after some difficulty Steven and the gems manage to figure out what's going on and Steven is able to change back to his normal self, but the fact that Steven almost died right then and there isn't exactly a laughing matter. Sure, there were some things that I didn't like about this episode, like Pearl's goofy crying, but I thought it was nicely put together. There was tension in the episode, and you could actually feel for the characters. Steven is terrified that he's becoming old, and the gems thought they were actually going to lose their friend. It's pretty heavy stuff. Of course, this is where the show hits a wall. As I mentioned before, the show doesn't seem to know how to handle drama beyond how it was done in So Many Birthdays. It seems like Steven Universe has two types of episodes, the funny slice of life kind, and the more serious, dramatic episodes. As the series progressed it began to use the dramatic episodes as jumping off points for the overarching plot of the show, which I should add is perfectly fine, but the problem is that Steven Universe doesn't manage to balance out these two styles of writing very well at all, nor does it seem to balance these elements properly within individual episodes themselves when there's overlap between the two. This leads to disjointed episodes with drama that starts to feel forced and plot elements that seemingly come out of nowhere. A lot of it has to do with how Steven Universe is structured as a series. Many of the episodes are of the slice of life variety, episodes about Steven dealing with the weird magic of the setting, his interactions with the people of Beach City, and sometimes both of those at the same time. This leaves whatever episodes are left open for the plot of the series, the mystery of the crystal gems. Steven Universe has a runtime of only 11 minutes per episode, which is the norm for a series on Cartoon Network. When you have such a short runtime, you have to make careful decisions about what content gets shown to the audience without it feeling bloated or rushed. That's where this show really drops the ball. It doesn't properly pace much of anything. So many episodes are dedicated to the episodic slice of life theme that there's not really enough time to get into the plot without condensing it, so to compensate, the show crams as much conflict and plot into the available space as humanly possible. Things become really awkward as a result. For example, let's look at another episode, On the Run. In this episode, Steven and Amethyst decide to run away together like two characters from a book Steven is reading, after a brief setup where Steven realizes that the gems themselves are unable to return to the planet they came from, the gem homeworld. It's also revealed that at some point in the past, other gems tried to do something that would have really screwed up the Earth, and Amethyst spends this part of the episode seemingly wallowing in her own angst. Steven and Amethyst then spend part of the episode essentially acting out what's in Steven's book, but then Steven says he wants to go home. That's when Amethyst tells Steven that where they live isn't her real home, and then decides that it'd be a great idea to take Steven to the place where she was made, revealing that she was created on Earth when the gems invaded thousands of years ago. The episode then rapidly devolves into cornucopia of moping, self-loathing, and forced conflict, all because of events that happen for no logical reason at all and could easily have been avoided, punctuated by a weightless, badly executed resolution. This episode is a perfect example of why the formula the show uses for its dramatic episodes is so tiresome. We're tricked into thinking that Steven and Amethyst are going to have a fun adventure hitchhiking together when it's actually about Amethyst's emotional baggage. That baggage itself isn't a problem, but rather the way that we're led into discovering it. I mean, it wouldn't be so bad if the show hadn't already done it like 11 times before this point. Steven the Sword Fighter, House Guest, and Alone Together, just to name a few. The show treats emotional episodes and big, heavy plot points like jump scares in cheap horror films. It might get you the first few times, but after a while you just get sick of it, robbing what should have been an important point of the story of all impact. The information on how Amethyst was created is actually a neat plot development, but it's ruined by how it's revealed practically out of the blue with only the flimsiest of setups. There are no real hints or clues about Amethyst's origin prior to this episode, so as far as I can tell, it just happens all at once because the episode needed some conflict and the writers didn't know how else to convey this important information about the characters to us. In a better paced show, we would have had something to work with beforehand. Finding out that Amethyst was created on Earth as part of an alien invasion and that her insecurities arise from her knowing how she was made is a pretty big deal, but it's hard to care about it because it comes out of left field. Sure, there have been other episodes indicating that Amethyst has some problems, but they revolved around other things like her relationship with Pearl or Steven, things that have nothing to do at all with how she was made. This really cheapens her character, which is a shame. I appreciate the attempt that was made to try and flesh out a character that was previously just the comic relief in order to turn her into something more three-dimensional, but instead of attaining some kind of actual depth, Amethyst goes from being a flat goofball character to a flat angsty one. It doesn't feel like any actual development happened because it took place in a period of time so short that it feels like they introduced an entirely different character, as opposed to adding depth to the one that they already had. To top it off, the information we're fed is delivered to us in such a clumsy, borderline nonsensical fashion that I'm not even sure spacing it out would have helped. Let's look at a show that had a character transition from comic relief into a deeper character the proper way, Avatar, The Last Airbender. I bet I can guess what you're thinking. It's Avatar, The Last Airbender. How is that a fair comparison? If that's what was going through your head just now, you're absolutely correct, it's not a fair comparison at all. Avatar is not only considered to be one of the greatest animated series of all time, but it also had a runtime of 22 minutes per episode, which is double the runtime of an episode of Steven Universe. Even so, the idea is the same. No matter what show you're working on or how long your episodes are, you need to learn how to properly pace things, especially things like plot and character development. The development of the character Sokka is a great example of this done right. Initially, Sokka is a goofy comic relief character, much like Amethyst. He cracks bad jokes and gets himself into trouble by running his mouth. That's the character we're introduced to, but as time passes we quickly begin to see depth beyond just those basic characteristics. Sokka cares deeply about his sister, his tribe, and his friends. On top of that, he doesn't have any special powers at all unlike the rest of the main cast, so he uses his wits to compensate, usually through clever improvisation and often to great effect. We also get to explore how he thinks and feels, the guilt he experiences for not being able to help his mother or his tribe, the anger he feels toward the Fire Nation for destroying his life, and so on. As the series progresses we see Sokka grow as a character and more importantly, we get to know him. He still does goofy things and he still says things he probably shouldn't, but he's also a valuable, effective member of our team of heroes, the main cast. Some of the plot points that define him are also resolved, especially when he learns to forgive and later befriends then reformed villain Zuko, a former prince from the Fire Nation, the same nation that basically ruined everything for him, killed his mother, and imprisoned his father. He becomes three-dimensional and changes a lot while still retaining a connection to who he was at the beginning of the series. That's true growth. Returning to Steven Universe, all we really know about Amethyst at first is that she's a goofball who eats a lot and doesn't like authority. That's about all we get up until On the Run, where suddenly we're supposed to accept that she's this flawed character with a tragic past. There's nothing in previous episodes to support that idea. We'd previously seen that she likes to butt heads with Pearl, but that isn't unexpected since their personalities clash. What On the Run does is cheapen a character with the clumsiest and most abrupt delivery of her background that you could possibly manage, all for the sake of drama. This kind of thing happens again with Amethyst in Reformed, where Amethyst basically acts like a jerkess for 11 minutes because she thinks that her friends don't like who she is and that she needs to change herself to suit their tastes. This is barely conveyed at all during the episode and seems to happen for no real reason at all, other than that Amethyst felt like it. Meanwhile, Steven tries to give her an online personality quiz with his smartphone, to which she responds sarcastically as part of a running gag that goes on for way too long. After that, Amethyst gets angry when Garnet asks her to take a mission. They're on seriously a mission to get rid of a dangerous monster hiding out in Amethyst's room while continuing to act out. This makes her look like a complete tool for messing around when she, Garnet, and Steven were all in legitimate danger. At the end of the episode, Garnet says that she might have been too hard on her, as if we were supposed to feel sorry for Amethyst after she acted like a total prick, made fun of Pearl behind her back, and behaved in a totally irresponsible fashion. This episode might have made more sense if the writer had more time to work with, maybe play on Amethyst's insecurities more and provide us with more of a reason for her to behave the way she did, but instead she goes from zero to pissed with very little provocation. This just makes her look like a crazy person instead of a sympathetic character. Amethyst isn't the only character that this happens with, either. Pearl acts like a completely different character in Rose's Scabbard. In this episode, Pearl becomes upset about Rose Quartz, Steven's, presumably, deceased mother. We're shown two completely different Pearls in this episode, a remorseful Pearl, and a jealous egomaniac who, in profound contrast to her established character, seems at one point to be totally unconcerned with Steven's safety, which I'll get to in a moment. For no reason at all she seems angry that Steven knows about Rose's armory, first shown in Lion 2, the movie, and that Rose's sword was hidden within a pocket dimension inside the mane of Steven's pet, Lion. You can argue that Pearl was just upset because she thought Rose told her everything, but it turned out that she kept secrets from her, especially when it's established earlier in the episode that Pearl took great pride in being Rose's sole confidant, but the episode doesn't really explain why she'd be angry with Steven. There's even a point where Steven almost falls to his death while chasing after her in an attempt to console her, and she doesn't even try to come to his aid. It feels like Pearl was swapped out with another character. The writers could have at least set it up by having Pearl express animosity towards Steven because she thinks he took Rose away from her, and maybe that's what they were trying to do, but it's written so poorly here that you can't really tell what's happening. During the climax of the episode, the chase that takes place at the end where Steven nearly falls, it seems like maybe Pearl is trying to run away from Steven because he reminds her of Rose and she just doesn't want to get into that business again, but if that were the case, then why would she let Steven, who for all she knows is essentially all that's left of Rose Quartz, possibly be lost forever, on top of everything else that is wrong with how she's depicted in the sequence. Prior to this we're shown that Pearl is protective of Steven, sometimes to a fault. Now we're supposed to believe that Pearl is so jealous and spiteful that she would let a little boy die just because she's having a childish temper tantrum. Boy, is it hard to explain everything that's wrong with Rose's Scabbard. What's worse is that this idea, that Pearl secretly resents Steven because of the loss of Rose, possibly could have worked somehow, but it's crammed into all of 11 minutes. From beginning to end it feels like an abridged version of several episodes rammed together. A plot that could have been adequately explored through several related episodes or in a longer single episode is thrown into a trash compactor. To top it all off, after Pearl nearly lets Steven plummet to his doom, in a vain attempt to cover up just how much of an asshole Pearl is in this episode, the writer has her do what Steven Universe does best, she begins to cry. She then acts out a past conversation with a hologram of Rose in a scene that reads like bad fanfiction, and Steven tries to cheer her up, but not before even more crying, because that's what happens in this show. Characters cry. A lot. Another problem with Steven Universe is that it seemingly has no idea how to convey remorse, pain, or emotional distress in general beyond crying. There's so much goddamn crying that even the staff writers themselves poke fun at it with references to in-universe parodies like Crying Breakfast Friends, a cartoon in the Steven Universe world. This is such a simple, childish, and superficial depiction of emotion that by the time the fifth crying scene in the series happens, you're already over it. There's no impact. Here's another comparison. This is an unexpected positive example. In Samurai Jack, the main conflict of the series is that the main character Jack has been cast into the future by his arch-nemesis, the evil shapeshifter Aku. Jack's sole objective throughout the entire series is to return to his own time, defeat Aku, and undo the bleak, miserable future that he created after Jack was unable to stop him the first time. In fact, you could say that it's even simpler than that, it's about a man who wants to go home. It's easy to get, we can relate to him a little, and we see Jack get close to his goal countless times only to be stopped at the last moment. It's a formula to be sure, but it never gets tiresome because the show handles it differently each time, and there are also other things going on while Jack's attempts to return to the past are taking place. One of my favorite examples of Jack getting time travel cock-blocked at the last second is an episode where Jack reaches a time portal that can take him home with the help of some Shaolin monks. During the mad final dash toward the portal, the monks are put in danger and are faced with insurmountable odds. Say what you will about Jack altering the past preventing this from happening, but whether Jack reaches the portal or not, without his help they're going to die. Realizing that he was unwilling to sacrifice the monks' lives to reach his goal, and more to the point, that he wasn't willing to make the same kind of sacrifice himself, Jack decides to turn back and come to their aid, saving them from certain doom. This causes Jack to miss his opportunity to use the portal, and what Jack believes at the time could be his last chance to go home. When the monks explain this to him, Jack doesn't bitch or cry. Instead he only replies, "Yes, I am getting used to that." That line right there and the way that it was delivered tells you everything you need to know about how Jack feels at that particular moment. We can feel his resignation and his uncertainty about the choice he's made, and there's some heavy emotions there even though the presentation is so understated. As an audience, we feel bad for him even though we know he'll probably get another chance in a later episode. Maybe that isn't an ideal example, especially when you consider that a character like Jack, a stoic and disciplined warrior, probably won't react to things the same way as Steven and at least 2 out of the 3 gems, but just imagine how that same scenario would have played out in Steven Universe. Half the episode probably would have been devoted to the characters arguing with each other and feeling sorry for themselves because they didn't get to the time portal, with plenty of tears to go around. This might make sense for someone like Steven, a young child, but for the gems to be as emotionally labile as they are just makes them look unstable and immature, and it's exhausting to the audience as well. Good drama shouldn't be overplayed. That's called melodrama, and the thing about melodrama is that it has a tendency to drag, not to mention a tendency to drag everything else down. Steven Universe handles drama in the bluntest way it can. Something bad happens, someone yells, maybe says a few cliché lines like, "You can't understand my pain," and then runs away crying. Characters wallow in self-pity for a while, and then everything's just fine at the end. It's manipulative, and makes it so almost none of the characters actually feel like real people. Any of these things would be perfectly acceptable on their own and in moderation, but this? Now you might say, but it's a cartoon, they're not supposed to be real people, but there's still a level of basic emotional competence expected from a character if they're going to be the tiniest bit likable. Someone like Shinji Ikari from Neon Genesis Evangelion, a series that multiple people on the Steven Universe staff are fond of, is emotionally incompetent and stays that way throughout the entire series, but that's because we're not supposed to like him, and his deliberate lack of growth underscores that. We are supposed to like the characters in Steven Universe, though. Back to the bad characterization done for the sake of cheap drama, here's another example, from Future Vision. In this episode, Garnet explains her ability to see various possible outcomes of events to see potential futures. After Steven learns from her just how many ways everyday situations could possibly go horribly wrong, Steven becomes frightened of the future and paranoid about his safety. We spend a while watching Steven become more and more fearful to the point where he's wearing a helmet indoors and afraid to touch a butter knife while making a sandwich, before the gems need to depart without him for an important mission, but not before Garnet tells Steven not to get on the roof while they're gone. This leads to a scene where Steven does precisely that. He gets on the roof during a storm in order to accept whatever fate awaits him there. This seems like a good opportunity for Steven to learn something, seeing as how he's finally confronting his fears head on, but instead Garnet rushes home to tell Steven to get off the roof. She explains that she saw this possibility coming from the moment she told Steven about her abilities, but she told him anyway, even thought she knew it would probably scare him, cause him to become paranoid, and then in turn cause him to get on the roof and almost hurt himself because for no reason at all she figured it would somehow bring them closer together if he knew about her ability to see the future. This is contrived writing intended to generate drama and sympathy for these characters, but instead it just makes Garnet look like a big dummy. It's extremely irresponsible of her, especially considering that she put a child's life in danger and then did nothing from that point forward to prevent this dangerous outcome from arising later. This is the same kid, by the way, that she's been protective of since the very first episode of the series. And she did it all in order to, in her own words, bring them closer. It's like if a childhood friend of yours tricked you into almost jumping off of a building and talked you down from it at the last minute before telling you, "I did this so we could be better friends." You probably wouldn't like that very much. Here's a more recent example of things being done right, Gravity Falls. It's mostly a comedy with mystery and supernatural elements added, and there's more emphasis on the laughs than the drama, but the show still manages to do the latter better than Steven Universe despite arguably having a less serious and less structured setting and premise. Let's look at the episode Not What He Seems, where Mabel, a character who acts like the goofy comic relief for most of the series, has to make the difficult choice to trust someone who betrayed her. It doesn't come out of nowhere, this is the result of episodes of build up to the moment where Mabel has to make that choice. It also doesn't feel contrived, because Mabel has been shown to make tough decisions before. It's a natural part of her character, one that we're familiar with. When Mabel actually does cry during this episode, it's because she's cracking under stress. It feels genuine, and it has impact because we haven't seen her cry 100 times by this point. This is how drama is meant to be handled, a lead into a big moment, not several little moments trying to pretend they're bigger than what they are. Now let's look at the lead up to the finale of Season 1 of Steven Universe. There were 4 major plot-relevant episodes leading to the finale, which were Marble Madness, The Message, Political Power, and The Return. These episodes could easily have been compressed into a single 2-parter because all they tell us is that Jasper, an evil gem from the gem homeworld, is coming, and that the inhabitants of Beach City are panicking. Everything else is just needless fluff used to pad out these events into more airtime than should have been required to present them. Another reason that Steven Universe is strangely paced is because of the fact that the plot episodes are written like the show is serialized, but the rest usually isn't. There are so many episodes where Steven is doing things like messing around with watermelons or trading toys, and then suddenly there's an episode that's important to the plot that might as well have been a footnote. Then we have episodes that almost feel like they've been aired out of order. The Return has a weird moment where Steven and his father Greg are driving away during the evacuation of Beach City. Greg tries to explain to Steven that his mother Rose was part of a rebellion against other gems that was fought in order to protect the Earth, and for some dumb reason this is shocking to Steven even though it's been well established by now that he knew this already. Pearl even explained it to him just 3 episodes before this one. It deserves to be said that it's not like the entire show handles lead up poorly. There are some genuinely intriguing moments involving the gem lore, like all the ancient temples and the monsters our heroes fight, but ultimately these are all just background elements. The stuff the show brings to the forefront are nearly always shallow attempts at creating tension that's squandered by doing silly things like having Garnet sing during the climactic final battle. While I love a good song in a show every now and then, having a character sing during such a tense moment seems incredibly out of place, and saps away the intensity of the fight. The ultimate problem with how Steven Universe is written is that it feels like 2 different shows rammed together into one. I've talked a lot about how the 2 styles of writing put on display in the show clash a lot, but there's more to it than just differences in tone between these 2 styles, there are also disparities in quality as well. The show is at its best when it's focused on surprise Steven. I actually think he's a competent, likable main character. When the show is about him goofing around or learning how to be a hero, you can see all the charm and heart the writers can put into a script if they put their minds to it. It doesn't always hit, but I can at least say that I've never disliked any moments where Steven was on the screen and the main focus of the scene or episode. For example, let's take a look at a Steven-centric episode, Fribo. In Fribo, Steven learns about gem shards and the magical properties that they possess, but due to his short attention span he ignores Pearl's warnings early in the episode about why these shards are dangerous, and that they should never be put into any sort of garment. He uses a shard to bring a mascot costume used by the local fry stand to life so that Petey, the person whose job it was to wear the costume for advertising, can go have fun like a normal kid. I enjoy this episode because right off the bat we see Steven trying to help someone. Of course, Fribo, the now autonomous mascot, misconstrues Petey's command to make people eat fries and goes nuts, attacking people with fistfuls of French fries in and around the fry stand. This prompts Steven to spring into action and stop the rampaging costume monster by coming up his own special solution. That is, by getting naked. He uses more of the magical gem shards, the same kind he used earlier to bring Fribo to life, to enchant his clothes and turn them into minions in order to provide necessary backup, allowing Fribo to be stopped and thus saving the day. It's humorous, and it works because not only does Steven defeat the enemy and make things right again after accidentally causing the situation in the first place, he does it in a way that makes sense to him. Everything in the episode works because it feels natural. Even the little heartfelt moment where Petey is explaining how lame getting a job is compared to being a kid feels right, because it's totally in character. The episode manages to be dramatic, funny, action-filled, and even a little creepy, and it does it all within 11 minutes. The idea of Steven learning from his mistakes, discovering himself, and becoming stronger could have made for a great series. Instead he's shoved aside during the course of the first season numerous times in order to focus on the gems. The gems are already established as heroes from the very beginning of the series and, more importantly, as Steven's mentors. As the series progresses, there's less focus on them teaching Steven how to be a hero, a real crystal gem himself, and more on the utterly dysfunctional nature of the gems. Again, this is done for the sake of cheap drama to make us think that these characters have depth and believable flaws the viewer can relate to or at least sympathize with. Instead, in its weaker moments, all the show has demonstrated to us so far is that Pearl's a selfish maniac who fails at conflict resolution, Garnet's irrational and irresponsible, and that Amethyst is dangerously unstable and has an active disdain for her supposed allies. Watch Reformed and tell me that we're supposed to believe that Amethyst has friends. Characters are allowed to be flawed, and a good character usually is, but those flaws have to be established properly. Characters with serious flaws usually start out a mess because they're supposed to improve and grow as people as the story progresses. The Gem's so-called progression as characters practically goes backwards. Pearl begins the series as a well-meaning worrywart, Garnet's a cool, collected, intelligent leader, and Amethyst is a carefree goof. Naturally, you can expose flaws in characters down the line. I'm not saying that's bad or that you're not supposed to, but Steven Universe spends several episodes of its first season showing you that you're supposed to like these characters and why before suddenly showing them acting grossly incompetent and antisocial just for the sake of sympathy, before pretending we're supposed to still like them afterward. This all happens at the expense of Steven, the only character who manages to remain likable and on top of things throughout the entire series. In the end, Steven Universe feels like two shows rolled into one. We have the fun, genuine, heartfelt adventures of Steven, and the pandering fanfiction tier drama that is the Crystal Gems. It's a show that too often feels like it was written by fans rather than by the creators themselves. A show like this needs a lack of pretension. In the character of Steven, I can see what this show really could be if the writers buckled down and really focused on telling a coherent story, namely one that's actually about him. Instead, they keep wanting to shine the spotlight on the Crystal Gems, a handful of poorly fleshed out, archetypical characters who don't have enough depth, individually or collectively, to be the main protagonists. It's like they writers are trying to have their cake and eat it too. It doesn't go so well.
Look at me now.
This section's going to be a lot shorter, mainly because it's going to focus more on me pointing things out in stills and animated GIF images. Before we get into this, let me say that I'm not expecting high quality, perfectly flawless animation from a television cartoon. I understand the budgets and the time constraints they have to work with, so some things aren't going to come out perfect. That's totally fine. That all being said, the decisions on animation and style made in Steven Universe are about as lackluster as its writing. Let's look at the style. Steven Universe uses a simple, clean, cute style reminiscent of the work of certain Japanese cartoonists, namely Osamu Tezuka. Things like crying and blushing are depicted in a similar fashion to what appears in anime, too. That's all fine and dandy. What the show has a problem with isn't style, it's staying consistent. A major issue with Steven Universe is that sometimes it seems like the animators just don't know how to draw. Or rather, the storyboarders don't. A recent trend with shows like this and Adventure Time is that the animators tend to animate in the style of the storyboarder. Episode quality can vary widely depending on who boarded it. As you can imagine, this can lead to major inconsistencies. Practically everything in Steven Universe feels amateur. Facial features slide around, characters' heights are inconsistent, and while I'm aware that there's a blog post from Ian Jones Quarterly himself stating that the latter is an intentional process, you can do loose styles without having it feel sloppy. Take Ren and Stimpy for example. Not my favorite show, but it handled a very loose animation style very well, and the looseness looked intentional. Steven Universe just feels wonky more than anything else. Let's use Marble Madness as our example episode. There's a scene where Peridot is attacking Steven and the gems with large mechanical hands. The gems fight while Steven does this. He looks like he was hit with the fist of the North Star. There are two things wrong with this. The first is the fact that Steven is making this face during what's supposed to be a serious moment, showing us that tonal inconsistency isn't just confined to the writing and certainly isn't the forte of the storyboarders. The second thing is how the expression is drawn. Steven's head has grown larger and his facial features have spread around. This is very similar to how exaggerated expressions are handled in anime, especially old anime like Sailor Moon, which Sue takes obvious cues from. The problem with that is it makes it feel like the expression is no longer part of the character body. Good expression in cartooning should come from the emphasis of certain facial features rather than the placement of them. These rules are evident in cartoons since forever, and especially in classic examples like Looney Tunes. Bugs Bunny here has simple features associated with most cartoon characters, with his large head, big eyes, and noticeable mouth. Watch how those features are used in the next series of images. Here, Bugs is angrily yelling about something. Since you yell with your mouth, that's what's biggest on Bugs' face. It is emphasized for the point of exaggeration, and vice versa. Here we see a bewildered Bugs. His eyes and pupils are widened to make him look deranged. His mouth is slightly offset, and one pupil is larger than the other to make him feel off-center, as if not quite everything is right at that moment. It's a great use of the facial features Bugs already has. Rather than try to create an interesting expression by emphasizing Steven's facial features, the artists instead took an entirely different face and plastered it on Steven's head. To build on the earlier Bugs example, let's look at a more contemporary show that does this properly, and also happens to air alongside Sue on Cartoon Network, The Amazing World of Gumball. Gumball uses a simple, cute style like Sue. The difference is it understands how to make an expression work. In this still taken from a scene in the episode The Party, Gumball is trying to ask out a girl on the telephone. Look at Gumball's mouth. It's small here because not only is he whispering, he's embarrassed as well. Then when the girl on the phone asks him to say something embarrassing, he then pulls this face. Gumball's small mouth from before expands to show his shock and apprehension, and his teeth go from straight lines to sharp zigzags to further emphasize this change in expression. His expression also fits the moment, which can't be said about Steven's face in the earlier example. The point here is that both Gumball and Looney Tunes properly use the rules of cartooning to make appealing expressions, which is what Sue failed to do. Here's another example from Gumball is this model sheet for Nicole from the first season. Like Sue, Gumball makes use of anime-ish expressions, but they're properly drawn and fit the look they were going for. This is inspiration done right without looking like some kind of cheap knockoff. Now let's look at some GIF animations. Apologies in advance for the crap quality. This fight from Steven the Sword Fighter is often said to be one of the coolest moments during the series, and the idea behind it certainly is cool. We get to see Pearl show off her skills. It's also apparently a reference to Revolutionary Girl Utena, which I've admittedly never seen, but in any case, this fight illustrates why the fights in the series don't work very well. Look at all those smears. Smears in animation are a technique used to imply very quick motion. It's mainly used as a time saver, since you can just draw one smear as opposed to multiple drawings, but you have to do it right. Here it's abused to cover up the very boring posing and slow motions to trick you into thinking the fight is moving faster than it actually is. Instead of making the fight look exciting and fast-paced, all those smears really do is make the swords look like they're made out of rubber. Here's another scene from an earlier episode. Again, the overuse, and misuse, of smears makes everything look rubbery and weightless. Instead of looking fast, it just looks so loose that it has no impact whatsoever, especially since the blue tentacles barely seem like they're getting hit. Garnet is deflecting them, they are supposed to be reacting to getting hit. Instead, what's really happening is that they're just performing a canned animation while Garnet is reacting to them instead. Here's a scene from the big final fight of the first season. Yeah, no, the one you'd think they would go all out for. Instead, all we get is another weightless, rubbery fight. Watch how the two of them harmlessly bounce off one another like plastic toys, rather than two fighters engaged in combat. When two characters are hitting each other with all they have, the audience should feel it. Impact isn't just a concept that applies to emotions, it applies to action as well. Instead of having any sort of impact, it just looks like something out of a cheaper episode of Dragon Ball Z or something. I suspect this all stems from a lack of proper direction. When you don't know how to properly do a sequence, neither will your animators. Now let's look at a good example from Spectacular Spider-Man. I'm very sorry for the quality with this one, I had some software difficulties while making this one. Look at how fast Spider-Man moves around without the animators having to constantly resort to crappy smears, thanks largely in part to all the great posing. Look at how much impact every hit has, especially when the rock breaks apart against Rhino's head. This is how a fight scene works. Sure, this show probably had a higher budget than Steven Universe, but skilled direction can make up for low budgets. Proper posing, placement of characters, and knowing how to use techniques like smearing correctly can make all the difference in the world. Let me reiterate that I don't have any hate for this show or anyone involved in producing it. I appreciate what it's trying to do, and it actually does manage to pull off some things properly. I love the pleasant atmosphere of the show, I like the backgrounds, And the music is fantastic. When the show focuses on Steven, like it did in the beginning, it's pretty fun at best and merely inoffensive at worst. I want this show to be better than what it is, but I think that requires the staff of the show to set aside their attachment to certain characters and try to create something coherent. If everyone working on that show truly thinks the show, as it is now, is the best that Steven Universe can be, then I can respect that. They definitely don't need to change anything to appeal to anybody, especially not me, but I just wanted to put this out there to vent my frustrations. Thanks for reading this far if you have and putting up with this rambling essay, and please, if you'd like to talk further about this or have any disagreements, my ask box is open whenever.